All right, I just want to wrap up the story of Jacob. The last 2 months, we've been going through the whole life of Jacob. Every week, we see Jacob trying to art smart and deceive to get what he wants. Mainly, remember the thing about the birthright. Usually in other religions and cultures, there are stories and lessons where the purpose is to show the followers what kind of virtues we should emulate or examples of living we should follow. The trouble is when we read the Bible and these characters in the Bible, we kind of don't see those things. We kind of get confused. Okay, what are we supposed to emulate? And when we read these stories of these characters in the Bible, because most of the time you see some flawed characters, you see some people are deceptive or have lacking integrity, just like Jacob. So very often we don't see any of that kind of stuff. And the reason why is because the Bible's purpose is not to show us how to live a good life. It's not a do's and don't book, right? The Bible's purpose is to show us how to meet God, who comes into people's lives and gives his grace to people who aren't necessarily looking for grace and necessarily deserve grace. So when we look at the life of Abraham and a little bit of Isaac and now Jacob, we see God blessing them even though they lead lives that are imperfect, just like us. So the verses I want to concentrate on tonight and pull out some principles is, next slide, is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 25. That's the story where he starts to, he meets a stranger and wrestles with them. And it turns out that it's God himself. Okay, let's go ahead and read those verses and then we'll get into it. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." I think I'm going to stop that. Oh. Okay. All right, I kind of read a little bit too much. Anyway, now at this point of Jacob's story, this is the climactic moment in Jacob's life. This is the turning point. After this incident, Jacob was a changed man. This is where Jacob meets God and had a life-changing encounter and experience with God. At this place, Jacob finds out what his life means, finally what his main problem is, and finally changes fundamental life strategy and has a transformation of heart. Sometimes in our lives we are confronted by circumstances that test our faith, even knock us down. Things we depend on don't seem to be reliable or strong. It could be our jobs, our wives, our family. It could be our bank account, our house, or income. It could even be our church, our friends, or even our pastor. And then down the road, we realize that the only one we can really rely on is God. Before this incident, Jacob went through the motions of believing in God. After this incident, Jacob draws near to God and his life changes. In order to understand the full scope of the turnaround of Jacob's life, we need to see the whole story of Jacob's life before this incident. Since we had a week break, and we only retained 10% of what we hear anyway, I'm going to give a recap of the story of Jacob's life and try to bring it all together and draw out some practical principles on having a life-changing encounter with God. You can't understand the problem Jacob had and the climactic moment we've come to in Jacob's life unless you understand the failure of his father Isaac and then the sin of Jacob himself. Yep, Jacob was not just the innocent old father who got tricked by Jacob. Isaac was given a promise from his father Abraham, who gave Abraham the promise by God himself. So let's start with Abraham. God promised Abraham, well, first of all, God comes to Abraham and basically says, I have a mission for you. I'm going to save the world through your family. God says, I'm going to send a Messiah, and he's going to be one of your descendants. In every generation of your descendants, one child will be chosen to bear the Messianic line. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, Matthew wrote to mainly Jewish people, and the first thing he writes is that he writes the genealogy of Jesus. He tracks back whose Jesus' descendants were, all the way to Abraham. So Jewish people understood this, that this promise was given first to Abraham and it got passed down through the generations. So Abraham's responsibility was to pass on that faith to this child, and in this case it was Isaac. And God's responsibility was to be with that child, to bless that child, to nurture and protect that child, and through him, another Messianic child will be born until the actual Messiah is born, which is Jesus. God also says to Abraham, I will give you the son of promise, and through the one who comes through him and through the final one who comes from him, the world will be saved. Okay? So Abraham then, of course, tells Isaac the same thing. The same thing will occur in your family. One of your children will be the leader, and he will be the Messianic child whom the Messiah will come through. Okay? So Isaac said, oh yeah, sure, great, all right. So one of my children will be it. So we know in the story that then Isaac marries Rebekah. And we know that twin boys were born. We got Jacob and Esau. Esau being born first, and Jacob was hanging onto Esau's heel, coming out second. So we also know, you remember, that God sends a prophecy to Rebekah. Rebekah says, what's going on in my womb? There's all this tussling going on in there. And so God gives a prophecy, and basically he says, the younger is the one. God chose Jacob. Jacob is going to be that Messianic child. Now, this is very important. So we all assume, well, I don't know if we all assume, but who knew about this prophecy? Was it just Rebekah? What do you think? Interactive. So we just read the Bible as it says. You say, okay, only Rebekah knew. But that wouldn't make sense, would it? Right? God has to have told also Isaac that he has chosen Jacob. He wouldn't leave him blind to what his plans were. Those of you who are married, one of the key things about being married is that guys tend to have one-word answers and wives tend to have paragraphs. All right? So they teach you, or marriage counseling anyway, when you come home, if your wife asks you, how was your day? One-word answer is not enough. You don't say, it's okay. All right? In the past, I always come home because I've been solving problems every day for every single patient. And when I come home, I just kind of want to, decompress. Don't ask me any questions. I'm going straight to my room, change into my sweats, and that's it. Let's have dinner. But your wife wants to know more than just a one-word answer. If I ask her, what did you do today? Oh, I had lunch. She could tell me exactly what each woman had for lunch. She could tell me what they were wearing and what the topic of conversation was. Okay? So Rebekah, hearing the prophecy from God, would she have kept it to herself or would she have told Isaac? I would say that. She would at least have told Isaac about that. She wouldn't have kept it herself. And I believe that God also told Isaac what his plans were. If we see that and understand that, then the rest of the story kind of makes sense. It kind of brings it, to me, it kind of makes some of those passages makes more sense to me. So if Isaac knew that God planned for Jacob to be the one, what's the problem? Well, we also read that Isaac loved Esau more. That's like us having two sons. One son is a 3-star athlete, great at football, great at basketball, great at baseball. Cool. Have another son who's more into reading books, all right? Stays home more. For me, I would favor that son who's really into sports. So it's that kind of thing where Isaac was more related to Esau more than to Jacob. And in old culture, and even now in some cultures, usually the older son inherits everything, right? That's just how it is. So they get the bulk of the property, And then if they have siblings, then they get some partial stuff, like endowments, okay? So Isaac's problem was he basically resisted God's will. Isaac wanted Esau, but God wanted Jacob. So when the time came, when Isaac was getting old, he already has made up his mind that Esau was going to be the one. He was going to be the leader. He's going to get the birthright. But God said Jacob was supposed to get it. All right. So growing up, since they were taught, Abraham's promise, what God has promised Abraham, Jacob hears this. Esau knows it because they talk about it, right? You want to pass what God has given to every single family down the line. So growing up, imagine Jacob knowing that and knowing that Isaac favored Esau over him, even though he knows that God has told his mom, and also Isaac knows that it's supposed to go to him. So you would feel like Jacob might be real resentful. Jacob might say, what's going on? It's supposed to be for me. Okay? So let's come to the story, what happens. So Rebekah knows that Isaac's going to get ready to give the blessing to Esau. And so you know about the deception. He disguised himself as Esau, and so Isaac thought that he was blessing Esau instead of Esau. But it was actually Jacob. So he gives him the blessing, and Esau comes in after getting the game, and he said, here I am. He said, oh, what happened? Who was it that came before? Because right away they already know who it was, right? It was Jacob who was disguised as Esau. So notice the response then. Next. Oh, actually I put some blessings on there, and as to point out, Isaac's blessing was the first one, when he thought he was blessing Esau, but it's actually blessing Jacob. And the second blessing was before he left to travel to the land where Laban was, okay? So I want to point out that that blessing is similar to the blessing that Abraham got from God, okay? It's the same, so they're passing that blessing along, all right? Next slide. All right, Isaac's response when he figures out that Jacob was the one that was there first, okay? So it says, Isaac trembled violently and said, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed. What is Isaac saying here? Well, let me back up. Is there something magical about that blessing? Can that blessing be changed? Like any contract, it was done under false pretenses. If you're a lawyer, Michael, right? If you're a lawyer and it was done under false pretenses, that could be void. You could change it. There's nothing magical about blessing. If Isaac found out that, well, I didn't mean it for you, I meant it for him, I'm just going to give it to him. Forget what happened before. You can easily change it. But no, he didn't change it, because what happened? He wasn't trembling in anger. He wasn't mad. He was trembling because he realized he was fighting God. He realized that God already told him who he was supposed to go to, was for Jacob. So at that point in time, realizing that God kind of created this to happen, that it should have been Jacob anyway, he didn't change it. He was done fighting with God. He was done saying, I want Esau, not Jacob, like you said I should. No, it's going to be Jacob. So he didn't change his mind. He left the blessing with Jacob. He's done fighting with God. The problem with the plan is Esau didn't get the message. Esau still said, the blessing should be mine. So, of course, he swears to kill Jacob. So now let's talk about Jacob now. So in Jacob's mind, there are two people standing in his way in terms of getting that blessing. It was his father, number one, and of course Esau. So instead of trusting God in the matter, he took matters in his own hands. He goes after his father and brother. Now in Jacob's mind, he's thinking, well, I know that God said that I'm supposed to get the blessing, that I'm the Messianic child. But I heard these two with my dad. You gave me this dad that's ignoring that and giving it to my brother. You have my brother who wants it and doesn't want me to have it, and now he's coming after me. So he had to figure out a way to get it himself. And so he came up with this the deception, okay? So he did it his way. Only problem now is it kind of backfires on him, because now Esau wants to kill him. So instead of getting the blessing, he still had one more guy that's in his way. And unfortunately, it blows up. So he has to run away, right? He has to leave the land that he was promised to inherit to go someplace else, because he has to run for his life, otherwise Esau would kill him. So oftentimes when we take matters into our own hands, whenever we think we can improve on what God has planned, a lot of times it backfires. So for Jacob, the result is he has to run for his life, run for the land that he was supposed to inherit. Okay, in Genesis 28, on his way to the land of Laban to meet his future wife, or wives, plural, God shows up in the dream in Bethel. And let's read a little bit of that. Genesis 28, verses 20 to 22. 28. Musical background. Let's see. See, I can't read that. It's too small, so I have to look it up. Then Jacob made a good turnaround, huh? Then Jacob made a vow. Well, right before that, so God appears to him and started establishing a relationship, and then repeat the promise that he gave to Abraham and in turn gave to Isaac. And he's repeating that promise to Jacob in the dream. So he wakes up, and verse 20 says, Then Jacob made a vow saying, If God will be with me, and which will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So he's still negotiating. He's negotiating with God. If you do this for me, if you give me what you promised, if you get me safely back to my father's land and give it to me, then you're going to be my God. God, you give me this, then you're going to be my God. You're going to be my guy. So even at that point, he's still trying to work things out on his own, using God as a means to get what he wants. Okay, then the story goes on. He gets married twice, has a family, and became a wealthy man. Eventually, God says, again, in a dream or comes to him, it's time to go back. Okay? And at the same time, Jacob also says, I'm getting tired of being here. My place is over there. I'm supposed to inherit that stuff over here, and I'm stuck over here. It's time to go back. So he picks up his stuff and has a plan to figure out how to get back home. All right? So still in his mind, there's only one person that's in his way, and that's Esau. So he has to think of a way to get past Esau. So, as you remember, the 10% that you remember, he develops a plan to try to kind of, impress Esau with a lot of gifts. So he sends all the animals in different groups with servants. He sends his family in different groups to greet him. That was his plan. He figures, Esau's kind of, thick in the head anyway, this might work, all right? This way I can maybe flatter him and kind of calm him down, and hopefully he'll forget about trying to kill me, okay? That was his plan. So let's go back at those verses, and let's see what happens. Because here he is, he's sending everybody across the river. The last people that went across is his own immediate family, and he's left alone, and it's dark. And he's probably praying, thanking God again, if you can get me through this, I'll pledge my allegiance to you. Just get me through this. I have one guy to get by, and then my whole life will be good again. Just got to deal with this Esau guy. But in verse 24, like we already read, a man suddenly appeared and jumped him, all right, in the middle of the night. Remember, there's no street lights, so you can't see. Somebody jumps him from behind. And they starting wrestling, it says, to daybreak. And the only way that you wrestle is if it's an even match. That means they both have equal strength. No one has the upper hand more than the other. No one could prevail over the other. So they're wrestling pretty much all night. And you might imagine all during this time, Jacob's thinking, what is this? Who is this guy that I'm wrestling with? I mean, The guy that I was supposed to be wrestling with, quote unquote, is Esau to get through him. And here I am, what is this going on now that I'm wrestling with this guy that I can't seem to win? So it comes to a point where they wrestle all day, all night, and then daybreak comes, and finally it ends. And it ends because the stranger then touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So have you ever had a dislocated finger before? I had it once. I fell and I broke my fall with my hand, and my pinky got dislocated. It's not straight anymore. But anyway, it's really painful. And so when Jacob's hip got pulled out of the socket, basically match is over, right? You have no push, you have no strength to push from when you're wrestling if your one leg is not useful. So in pain, basically, the contest is over. So when he got touched, when the Hebrew word touch is what it exactly means. There was no pulling, no hard strength pulling his leg off. It's just a touch. So it indicates that this guy had a lot of power. And so at this moment in time, Jacob also realizes that this is not an ordinary man. So this was God. Okay. So next verse, next slide. So after the man touched Jacob's hip, the man asked, "Why are you still holding on?" What he did to Jacob meant Jacob knew now he couldn't win, right? So over the next 2 or 3 verses, Jacob asks, "I want your blessing, I want your name." So here, Jacob has changed his whole strategy toward God and his whole strategy toward life. Before, he was trying to wrestle with God, trying to control God, use God for his own purposes. He thought the main problem in his life was Esau. All of his life, he thought the thing that really had messed him up was that he had to wrestle with Esau. But instead, he was actually wrestling with God all this time. He was trying to control God. And that was the meaning of his life. That was the problem of his life. Jacob had thought that finally I'm going to meet the one who I've been battling all my life. Finally, I'm going to meet the one and I'm going to solve the issue. And this is D-Day, meaning that this is the day that he was to go and finally meet Esau. It was that he thought it was anyway. But instead of wrestling Esau, he was wrestling God that night. So now he realizes that the blessing he wanted all his life was from God. It was not from his father or through his mother, but from God who promised it to him from the beginning. He wanted to know God intimately now. He says to know one's name is to know one's character and essence. He really wants to know who God is. So God is now the central theme in his life. To know God's name is to know God's face. So he moved from struggling with God to struggling for God. So at the end, I'm running out of time. So we're going to go to the 4 principles that I want to point out from these 4 verses. And the theme is, how do we meet God? Not just to know him or to know about him or believe in him in some general way. How do we actually have a life-changing encounter with God like Jacob did? So there are 4 reasons why Jacob was able to have an encounter with God. And there are these 4 principles that I put up there. Number 1, you have to meet God yourself. Number 2, you meet God in your weakness. Number 3, you meet God at the center. And last, you meet God in his weakness. Let's take the first one. You have to meet God yourself. Kind of obvious. Jacob was alone that night before the day of crisis, before he had to meet Esau. He was alone to think, to reflect, and to pray. And that's when he has an encounter with God. You have to meet God personally, individually, yourself alone. For instance, you might like coming to a church, maybe this church. You like the singing, the worship. You like the testimonies. You like the people sharing about their faith. And then you have to move away for some reason. It might be if you're younger, you move to college, a job, you have to move away. And so when you move away from your home church. And then things seem to be not as real anymore. God doesn't seem as real anymore. You're alone. And because God hasn't really penetrated your life, maybe you haven't met God personally yourself. Sometimes we have to face some of our most important issues alone. If you go into surgery, it's great to have people come to visit you at the hospital before you go to surgery, but when they start wheeling you to the operation room, it's just you and God and the surgeons. So to really know God personally, those are the times that really counts. Number 2, you have to meet God in your weakness. When did Jacob really realize that he was wrestling with God? When did he realize God was in his presence? When did he say that I don't want to lose you, I want to hold on to you? Well, it's when, verse 25, when he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. At the moment of pain, when he was weak, at the moment when he was helpless. When we realize that our self-sufficiency will often lead to frustration and failure, and when we give it up to God, that's when we see God's work in us, grow us who we were meant to be. I have a Tim Keller quote in the next slide. He says, God becomes, out of love, the enemy of your old self, the self that's not built on God, and brings you into weakness so you can wake up and begin to grow a new self. See, God is trying to help you fight that old self, to make that old self weak so that the new self can then grow, to be the person that God wants you to be. The third principle, you meet him at the center. God only meets you at the center of your life. Jacob goes from a person who negotiates with God and knowing about God to actually knowing God. Remember his prayer at Bethel at the end of chapter 8? He negotiates with God. You can see at the end of chapter 8, he says, all right, God, if you help me get this, get the leadership of my family, get my land, get my inheritance, okay, then I'll serve you. In other words, here's what Jacob had been doing. There's the blessing. God, can you help me get it? I'll work with it if you can help me get it. Now, he realizes that he's been using God as a means to an end. Instead of saying to God, help me get the thing I really need to be blessed, to saying, all I want is you yourself, your approval, your friendship. You have the blessing I've been needing all along. You are the source of the blessing. You are the thing that fulfills me. We have a tendency when we first go to God, we go to God because we think we know what the center of life is. For instance, if you fall deeply in love with somebody and then you guys break up. So what do? You feel depressed and you go to God. You maybe pray that God will help you find somebody else, or pray that God will get you back together again. In other words, we're going to God so that more in the periphery of life. He's not the center of life. There's other things that are becoming the center of life. We want God to help us get that center that we think is the center of our life. But God says, I don't want to be on the passenger seat. Remember Mark Mitchell preached about that as an example? He wants to be in our driver's seat. He doesn't want to meet us in the suburbs of our life, but he wants to meet us downtown. What God is saying to Jacob, what God is saying to us, is I will only come into your life when you begin to see your lack of relationship to me is the problem, beneath all your problems. And a great relationship with me is the solution beyond all of the solutions you plan. Until you see I have been the center of all along, till you see I am the center, until you see make me the center, you cannot have an encounter with me. Okay, so you meet him yourself, number 1. You meet him in your weakness, number 2. You meet him at the center. Jacob has done all these things, by the way. He has met him alone. In his weakness, he finds God's reality. He's recognizing that God is the only one who can bless him. So he has made God center in his life. And what happens? Well, he gets the blessing. But there's a puzzling thing in verses 28 to 30 when it says, you have been wrestling with God and man and have prevailed. What do you see saying there? God is saying, you have been fighting me, you've been fighting everybody else, you've been a conniver, you've been a wrestler, you've been a terrible person, and I reward you. Such a paradox that here's a guy that's holding on to his dear life, crippled, completely powerless, and God stands over him and says, winner. How could God possibly bless somebody so flawed? So there's one more principle, one more thing in this text without which you can't have an encounter with God, without which Jacob couldn't have an encounter with God. First principle is you have to meet him in his weakness. What does this mean? Well, look at verse 25. Everybody knows who this is. Everybody knows who the mysterious figure is, right? When a man saw that he could not overpower him, well, this is God. But he could not overpower him. Why did God just beat him and move on and give Jacob what he deserved? Here God says he could not overcome him. Why doesn't he say God just refused to overcome him? Maybe withheld his power. Why does it say he could not? Well, it's kind of a precursor to the future. If God had come down into this relationship in power, he could have won the battle, but he could have then lost Jacob. If God had just said, I'm going to wipe out all evil, he would have won the battle, and he would have lost all of us. See, Jesus Christ came just like God came, in weakness. Jesus Christ came just like God came, limiting himself. Jesus came just, did I say that? He prevailed, God prevailed like Jacob prevailed. It looks like Jacob lost pretty bad, right? Yet what does God say? Your name is Israel, for you have wrestled with God and you won. Jacob is the perfect picture. He wins by losing. But Jesus also is a perfect picture. He wins by losing. The reason Jacob could only get a touch of God's wrath, was because of the ultimate messianic child, which is Jesus. He got it all. Jacob was saved through weakness. Jacob was saved because of the weakness of God. So are we. So how should we treat God? Well, go seek him and hang on to him like Jacob did. All right, let's pray. Dear Father, we thank you for giving us this time for us to consider how God in his love sometimes wrestles us into a changed life and in times of weakness. We ask that you would make it possible for us who are experiencing weakness to look to you and hold on. We ask that you make it possible for us who are putting in the backseat of our lives, make you the center of our lives. And we pray for those who need an encounter with you to remember what you did for us on the cross and pray that you'll make yourself a reality to them. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.